Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. This is part 2 of my lively discussion with historian Jason W. Moore. If you'd like to support this sort of content and the work that we do, you can go to our website, theAnalysis-news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Don't forget to get onto our mailing list. That way you're always up to date every time there's a new episode. And like and subscribe to the show on podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify, as well as onto our YouTube channel. And please share the show if you enjoy this content. See you in a bit with Jason. Joining me now is Jason W. Moore. He's a historical geographer and professor of sociology at Binghamton University in upstate New York. He's also the coordinator of the World Ecology Research Network and is author of several books, including Anthropocene or Capitalism, as well as A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, which he co-wrote with Raj Patel. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you.
What a treat to be here today, Talia. Thank you for having me.
I'm sure there's some people listening who are thinking, so what? What does this all mean? Why is any of this relevant to have different perspectives or to not focus on, this man-made binary, this binary with nature? And I think if you want to put this analysis into practice, then you have to look at how relevant this could be for the climate struggle. So what would you say to that for, revolutionary struggles or for climate movements such as, there are several, I'm thinking even debt for nature or, movements which argue for the cancellation of debt, for example. For other climate groups as well, how would you say, or how important is this, adaptation of the language and the perspective that you're deploying? How important is that for their struggles to be even more effective? Or is it more of a linguistic issue?
Yeah, well, of course, it's not. It is and it isn't linguistic because language is a crucial nexus of power. I always love it when Marxists, who should be committed to the critique of ideology, are like, oh, that's just changing the words around. It's clearly not. The analysis of the weak links of capitalism that proceeds from man versus nature leads to forms of neo-Malthusian technoscientific authoritarianism. And this is profoundly and thoroughly anti-democratic. From the origins of second wave environmentalism, think the first Earth Day in 1970, the first UN conference on the human environment in 1972. From there onwards, the main ideological message has been listen to the science. Trust us, give power to the experts. This is fundamentally anti-democratic. Here, I agree entirely with Naomi Klein about the climate crisis, who basically says, echoing 60s radicals, the issue is not the issue. The issue of the climate crisis is an issue of democracy. It is a crisis of democracy. And therefore, the first step has to be the assertion of popular power over the political structures of the world and to confront the oligarchies and the national security states and the imperial apparatus in the case of the United States and a few other countries that are fundamentally about the dictatorship of capital. And we should stop pussyfooting around the issue of, and with the illusion that somehow if only we elect enough social democrats to parliament, they will legislate socialism and the climate crisis will go away. That's not how it's going to work. The history of the 20th century, which eco-socialists routinely ignore, is a history of counterinsurgency and regime change politics. And it's baffling to me that folks want to devolve into single-issue politics. Single-issue politics really emerges out of the crisis of Fordism in the 1960s and was an invention of the new right, and then was picked up by elements of a centrist liberal professional managerial class strategy. Environmentalism was one of the major ones, not just in the US, but in Western Europe. And the result is something like, well, you're in Berlin now, if I remember right.
That's right.
Something like what you see with the German Greens. The German Greens love war.
Yeah.
They love war. And if you look at the kind of civilizational rhetoric coming out of the Greens and the warmongers in Germany right now, which is in the midst of the greatest rearmament since 1936. What could go wrong? Then we begin to hear that old language of the civilizing project. The Russians might look like us, but they're not us. They don't value life. Joseph Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, is saying, well, Europe is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. Yeah, exactly. This is exactly. So we talk about, language. Power, ideological power flows through language and flows through the power to name. Most so-called radicals around the climate are not saying the problem is capitalism, and not just capitalism as some system of corporate power. Yes, corporations, but also the increasingly tight nexus of the bourgeoisie and its political representatives, which is spectacularly advanced or degenerated, as the case may be in the United States, but clear in the UK, clear in many other places. The left has been completely destroyed. The proletarian forces have been defeated across the global north. In the global south, you see the semi-proletariat organizing, but in very ideologically confused ways. And so what's necessary is a clarity, a historical clarity over the actual dynamics of capitalism in the web of life. And that means that we need a new conceptual apparatus that does involve a different linguistic turn. And let me point out that you understand this, Talia, but some of these idiots in the eco-socialist crowd say, well, it's just language. Every liberation movement in the modern world ever has insisted on a new language. Why? Because the language of the dominating and exploiting classes is one designed to keep people down. And that's only intensified in the era of social media and misinformation fetishes and all of that.
Right. And all knowledge production is a representation of those power relations and inequalities that these movements are also trying to undermine.
Absolutely.
So the language is important, but you bring me to my next question then. And I think Gramsci, the Italian thinker and writer, would be really important to bring in this particular moment, because I think it was in 1919, after the April strike and after he was maybe a bit pessimistic over how the workers' councils were failing in a way, he wrote more about hegemony and how the issue is perhaps within the mindset of the proletarian or the working classes themselves, because they've the values or the hegemonic values of the bourgeoisie have been inculcated into the mass consciousness of the proletariat. And so there needs to be a shift in their way of thinking and way of viewing the world. So it sounds to me like you would still view that argument as being extremely pertinent right now, that there still has to be a sort of ideological shift in order for these various climate movements that are so multifaceted, multiracial, multinational, for them to sort of rise up and form a counter-hegemonic force.
Now, right now they can't, because they have fetishized nation, they have fetishized race, they have fetishized colonialism, they have fetishized, and therefore all of these and more, in order to first lay out all the differences between, if you will, the workers of the world or the world semi-proletariat. And we have to confront that head on. We have to understand that what people are embracing under the sign of decolonize everything and intersectionality is, in fact, a subaltern, if you will, expression of the bourgeois strategy to divide and conquer.
Right, to break up solidarity, essentially.
Exactly. You want to say, okay, we want, if you're white, you go over here. If you're black, you go over here. If you're a woman here, a man here, straight here, queer here, all of this, it's embedded in, say, some of these absurd ideas that circulate within the academy, for instance, of the privilege walk and of progressive stacking and all of this. It is designed to set workers against each other, because, of course, there are more of us than there are of them being not European white men, but the 1%, the owners of capital and the owners and possessors of the means of violence and destruction. So that's a fairly simple notion, but I would say, you invoke Gramsci, and especially I love the historicization of this in 1919. So Gramsci and Lenin, and let's remember, Gramsci was a communist, a class struggle communist, and was a Leninist. So what happened in the 1980s and 90s is all of these professors discovered Gramsci and discovered others that they could turn into kind of like professional managerial class toys or puppets, like hand puppets, and they could cosplay being revolutionary without actually having to deal with the excruciating political conjuncture of that moment in 1919, when Lenin and Gramsci and many others understood the proletarian revolution had been beaten back and defeated in Germany, many other places. And of course, the consequence of that was the rise of Mussolini and Hitler.
And then he was in prison for many years.
Yes, and of course, Gramsci was put into prison, which is a good reminder of, look, if you're going to organize to take away the wealth and power of the 1%, be ready, because they're not playing around. They're going to put you in jail. They're going to kill you. They're going to send the death squads and the drones. They're going to dump Agent Orange on you. They're going to do whatever they need to do to prevent your movement from gaining wealth and from redistributing what is, in the bourgeoisie's view, their wealth and power. Of course, we understand the sources of all wealth are humans and the rest of nature, as Marx reminds us. But in 1919, as Gramsci and Lenin were dealing with this problem, Lenin begins a famous turn towards national liberation movements. And he begins to understand, this comes together in the famous Baku Conference of 1921, that the Archimedean lever of the world class struggle was in the third world, in the colonial world at the time, in the global south, that this was the Archimedean lever of worldwide class struggle, that it wasn't some simplistic, naive, social democratic workerism. Remember, the socialists all voted for war in 1914. And so we want to really understand that history as we look at the present moment and begin to identify a working class as an agent of history that is not the old Eurocentric, economistic, formalist working class. It is what I have argued for, a planetary proletariat, proletariat, biotariat, and femitariat, unifying paid labor with unpaid work of women, nature, and colonies. Not as a typology, but we are all biotarians now. We are all femitarians. We are all enmeshed in this web of cooperation and proletarian solidarity, at least potentially, but we'll have to rebuild because the neoliberal ruling classes have really defeated the working classes, but also convinced many leftists that they shouldn't want state power. And so I see this all the time in the North American Academy. North American academics love indigenous peoples as long as they don't actually take power.
Yeah, just do land acknowledgements. It's fine.
Yeah, let's do that, or we could say, land acknowledgements, decolonialize this. And so like when Evo Morales takes power, they're like, oh no, we can't have that. And what I say is, look, first of all, building socialism, not that easy. And second of all, there's one group in the world that knows socialism works. That's the bourgeoisie. Like they know that socialism works, so they sabotage it. They impose sanctions. And at the heart of it, this goes back to the Lenin and Gramsci point, at the heart of it all is, from the standpoint of empire, they don't care about communism or not. They don't care what you call your state. What they fear is an independent third world or an independent global south. That's why the Americans hated the Soviets. It wasn't about communism. It was the Soviets sat on all of that wealth and power and oil and everything else, and they couldn't be overthrown until the end of the 80s when they were overthrown.
Well, you speak about the 1% and corporate elite. And if you're looking at climate movements and young people who are so fed up with power and resources being consolidated in a very, very specific, narrow corporate class that supports big oil and gas and is also supported by big oil and gas because of all the lobbies, how do you unseat that consolidation of power? Because you could have, all the climate movements in the world, but if you have this corporate class that has kind of adopted this form of green capitalism as well, this neoliberal green capitalism of, we'll just, we'll invest in carbon capture and storage and enhanced oil recovery to make it look like big oil and gas is cutting emissions and are kind of on the side of the young people. Like they're shifting, they have their ecological solutions that aren't really solutions. So how do we, I guess there are probably two aspects of that. The language is incredibly important that you mentioned, but how do we actually unseat those centers of power?
Well, first we have to have clarity of analysis. And so what's often called green capitalism, and your summary is excellent, is in fact a post-capitalist strategy for a civilization based on political accumulation. That is one in which there are many of the accoutrements we would associate with capitalism, but it's fundamentally governed by a political dynamic. I call this the too big to fail dynamic, out of the phrase that came to fame in the Great Recession, where the big financial institutions were, quote, too big to fail. So Obama comes in, he bails out the criminal banksters and puts 6.5 million people out on the streets. That's political accumulation. That's not actually a very common occurrence in the history of capitalism, but increasingly so, because the masters of mankind, to borrow Adam Smith's phrase, understand that their grasp on wealth and power depends on politics, on controlling the states and controlling the military and repressive apparatus. Also, the surveillance apparatus, which, as we know, is quite advanced in the U.S. with the very, very tight relationships, really enmeshed, interpenetrating relationships between Silicon Valley capital and the national security state. This has all come out with the Twitter files and many other reports
and with
in recent years.
Well, it seems like the police have some slush money funds where they can buy all sorts of surveillance tech.
That's exactly right. So we've witnessed not only the massive growth of a surveillance economy, but also what David Gordon and Sam Bowles once called the garrison economy, the growth of the guards and the prisons and the police and everything else. And so there's, I think, a lot of confusion is the nicest way to put it when we come to these climate justice movements. By and large, they refuse to identify capitalism, and they talk about it as if it's a system of corporate power. No, it's a system of class power in which the reproduction of ruling class power depends on what? The control over the state. Yes, they have an ideological apparatus. Yes, there are hegemonic and counter-hegemonic struggles. But what happened in the 1980s and 90s is that academics said, well, we're going to talk about counter-hegemony like that's all about civil society, forgetting or closing their eyes to the reality. Civil society was an invention of what was called in 1968 the Cultural Cold War, this very, very intimate connection between what we now call the nonprofit industrial sector and cultural counterinsurgency worldwide. This has given rise more recently to what we call color revolutions, where you have CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy active, overthrowing, as in Ukraine in 2014, the democratically constituted government, many other examples we could provide. But there's this sense of like, oh, we're just going to resist, and then somehow the resistance is going to translate into pressure politics that will convince capitalists to whatever, give up their wealth and power. This is kind of the Greta Thunberg strategy. And by the way, she's not new. Pretty much there's an exact parallel from 1992 around Rio with Severin Suzuki, the child of one of Canada's greatest environmentalists, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah. David
so
Suzuki.
this is very common. We're gonna talk. We're gonna have all this woke language, but we're not actually going to name the centerpieces of the coherent and cohering mechanisms of capitalist class power, and also to understand. Look, people are going to say that I'm wrong, but capitalism is dead. Capitalism is in its zombie phase. It's still moving around. It's still deadly. But the ways that it has for 5 centuries overcome its crises no longer exist. Those frontiers of cheap nature are no longer there, but also the frontiers of cheap waste are now gone. And what does that mean? Here's a great example. Climate change has already suppressed agricultural productivity. Fully 8 years productivity loss have been recorded so far. According to the OECD, the 24-member country member club of rich or semi-rich countries, agriculture will absorb half of all the costs from climate change. That's fundamental because the whole apparatus of capitalism of expelling labor from the countryside rests on agricultural revolutions. Those days are over. Climate-smart agriculture is not going to rescue anything. So once we begin to develop a clarity, then the answer becomes really an old-fashioned answer, that it's necessary for the popular forces to seize state power and to maintain it at all costs. And we know the violence that ensues after that, but we also know the violence that ensues from failure. I think of the U.S. interventions, the death squad imperialism in El Salvador in the 1980s. The consequence of the failure of, or the defeat rather, of the proletarian forces, the FMLN, in that struggle has led to this dystopian prison industrial hellscape that is El Salvador today. So you think that the struggle is indeed worth it. It's not going to come from just resisting. We saw this with Occupy. You have to have a politics.
Right. And what if it's essentially grassroots? To me, it sounds like you're saying that, these different indigenous movements, for example, and I think there was something recently in Colombia even where they were taking back some of the land and having maybe different councils of how to manage that land. Would you say that that's not revolutionary enough? Because you're saying that people need to take back.
I would say those are
structure.
defensive strategies. Defensive strategies, of course, are the order of the day, given still the worldwide political balance of class forces. So that's inevitable that we will have many defensive struggles. They are called resistance struggles. They should be defended. The problem is don't meet my criteria for revolutionary action. The criteria is this part of a strategy to actually take power and take power away from the bourgeoisie. We know the long and violent history of soft power, of hard power, of economic hitmen and death squads and regime change, train the militaries to take power, engage in terrorism like with the U.S. with Contras in Nicaragua. We know what's coming. This is not going to be a surprise. And it is the ruling class is not going to be somehow convinced. You mentioned Colombia. Of course, Colombia has long been known as the most sort of dictatorial so-called democracy in the Americas. Twice FARC has laid down its arms, and twice what happened? They came back and made him pay for it. And FARC, I don't think, is laying down its arms again. And so this has to be done in terms of a Gramscian strategy. Gramsci was not like, we don't need to be ready to seize state power. We need to indeed identify the as Marx would say, the rich totality, the rich diversity of struggles, and look for their common threads, and then look for the weak links in the imperialist chains of power. Because, of course, taking state power is not enough. Look at Venezuela, subject to basically constant sanctions and regime change politics, soft power, color revolution, mercenaries, undoubtedly financed through the CIA black budget coming in. This is the dynamic of our times, and I worry that a lot of these resistance struggles, the indigenous peoples in Colombia, they know what this is like. I'm not saying they don't know what the front lines are, but if you look at what's the politics of of social democratic academics and others, professionals in the global north, there is a complete memory holding of all of this history, including in the United States. It's absurd in the United States where, for Christ's sake, the national security state killed or had Martin Luther King killed. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is like out in day. This has been reported for 3 decades. Actually going back to the 70s even. So so we need to be engaged in defensive struggles, they need to be linked to a serious, multiracial, anti-imperialist, feminist working class politics. Otherwise, you end up with a rolling series of resistance movements. You have Occupy here, you have the No DAPL over there, you have all of these isolated struggles that don't ever congeal into an actual politics. Or they just subordinate themselves to social democratic politics. You know this, you mentioned growing up in Toronto, you know this from the New Democratic Party. The New Democratic Party never misses an opportunity to move to the right. And this is the case for social democrats across the world for the past forever.
Yeah, that's also taking place right now in Germany, where the AfD has come to power in certain parts of the country, and then the Social Democrats actually start instituting more right-wing policies to try to take back those voters who then went over to the AfD. But it doesn't work that way. That's not how you're actually going to get people back. You increase your electorate if you actually have the right sort of left policies that will enable workers to have some sort of better standard of living and rights, and to redistribute resources, and not just, we're going to have, anti-migrant policies.
And the liberal diagnosis of the problem is white supremacy. And that is, for one thing, wrong. Yes, white supremacy is a result of the process, but this is part of the general realignment of social democratic parties, as people like Elizabeth Humphreys have detailed, around the neoliberal agenda. Of course, this should not surprise us that social democrats, almost without exception, and there are one or two exceptions, move to the right. They cooperate with the deep state. Social democrats hate the left. They hate the left more than they hate the right. And so what they want to do is either move right, like you're saying with the AfD, or, and this is all across Europe, as you know, the rise of the populist right is channeling working class outrage at the social democratic and centrist liberal Christian democratic model. And working class people should be outraged. It's a failure of the left. It's a failure of the academic cultures which embraced anything but class leftism, ABC leftism, and refused to, keep their hands on the tiller and steer towards the North Star around working class revolution and the expansion of democracy and of working class power. Socialism is not more power for the professional managerial class. Socialism is more power for the working class.
Right. And having this totalizing view of everything as just being a product of white supremacy, in a way, it reinforces those racialized structures and white supremacy, because it doesn't actually present a threat to the classes that sort of control the modes of production and that are the consolidated bourgeois or rich elite. Like if you just focus on that aspect, which is a result and maybe not the driving factor, then you don't get any sort of real shift in the material conditions or in redistribution of power, or any sort of universal working class struggle, which would actually in turn contribute to the livelihoods of racialized and marginalized people. So it's the outcome of that lens or of that way of understanding the world. In a way, it just reinforces it. It doesn't lead to any change.
It absolutely reinforces it. We see this around the critique of settler colonialism. What's the politics of settler colonialism? But is supposedly ethnic cleansing. The inverse of it is inverted ethnic cleansing, and that's not what we need. We don't need more nations. We need the proletariat to run the affairs of the planet and to proceed to abolish class distinctions. Around this question of like race and racial capitalism, much of the current vogue is a rejection of the Communist parties, I think in the U.S., the Communist Party USA's position on multiracial working class unity, pioneered by people like Du Bois, Claudia Jones, and many others in this period. And I've written a little bit about this. I've urged people to really go back and consider the multiracial, anti-imperialist, feminist proletarian strategy, all of which sounds very old-fashioned, but it sounds old-fashioned because the neoliberal ideological offensive has memory hold and destroyed our capacity to remember these traditions. It's deracinated us, uprooted us from traditions of communist and socialist struggle. And whether we agree with those traditions or not, or we want to advance them, renew them, be creative around them, we need to remember what they were in order to do that, not simply reinvent woke wheels.
Right. And just one final thing, I don't know if we'll have much time to get into this, but if you look at the sort of legal apparatus that's in place after the First World War and the Second World War, you have the right to self-determination. And it's all, this rights framework that is based around the nation state. And that in itself is not actually going to cut it, because if you look at, for example, the right to self-determination of Palestinians, I just don't see how, having a two-state solution, for example, is all of a sudden going to address all of the issues, because ultimately there's a class factor. And as you were talking about the various capitalist ways of cheapening nature and cheapening humans and, pulling people into this system which cheapens them, that's not going to be addressed if you just have rights that align with the interests of nation states. And, the interests of nation states also serve the interests of the neoliberal class. So I guess we need to get somewhere, and there has to be some sort of sovereignty for the Palestinians, for example. But, just seeing it as an issue of statehood is, in my view at least, just horribly wrong.
Well, and there's a profound naivete around national self-determination, because as the Russians discovered in 1917, simply hoisting the red flag, or whatever flag of color you choose, does not make you independent. The imperialist countries do not want independence. This was what America had to wrestle with as the world hegemonic power after World War II, how to control and dominate a world without a formal colonial structure. And they were wrestling with this all the way through. And basically, you could go along with the Americans, or you would be subjected to, say, the experience of Vietnam. That's something that I think has not been properly digested. There is this long history of what it takes to win self-determination, never mind building socialism. And many of these rad-lib academics go out and say, well, socialism failed, it didn't do this, it didn't do that. It's like, well, according to whom? I mean, according to those who benefited from the defeat of Nazism, maybe socialism succeeded. Maybe that was what socialism in the 20th century was about. Maybe it was about opening space for third world movements. Right. Do we think for a minute that Libya, which went from the most secular and prosperous country in Africa to a country where there are open slave markets on the streets of Benghazi, do we think that Libya for a moment would have been destabilized if the Soviet Union was still around? So there's that kind of naivete that comes from memory holding history. I called this in one recent essay, the flight from history. And this is what pretty much defines most of this rad-lib posture, radical posturing, decolonial set of arguments in the world. And it crucially undermines our capacity to forge the worldwide proletarian solidarity necessary to begin to push at the imperial structures that hold the capitalogenic climate machine together. And that, I've said this many times, if we want to do something concrete, let's demand that all of the European armies withdraw from the rest of the world. The American armies, get the French out of Africa, right. Get the U.S. out of Africa, shut down the bases, 700 plus bases, 3 new bases in the Philippines to face off against the Chinese now. These are the real coercive instruments of political power. They're not going to go away because people occupy a town square. Now, occupying a town square may be necessary as part of the struggle. Don't get me wrong, but it's not like Congress is going to convene and say, let's shut down the bases.
Well, I think next time we talk, it would maybe be good to do an episode on the various strategies and also, real existing socialism. So the different experiences of the Soviet Union, for example, and whether this vanguard strategy that's driven by a specific party is the way to go, or if there could have been correctives to that. So I think, that's a whole other debate, which I think we could get into next time. And there's a lot of scholarship on that. So Jason W. Moore, it's
Absolutely.
Been really great to speak to you. Thanks so much for your time. And let's talk again soon.
Talia, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for such a lively conversation. And for those who are interested in anything that I've just said, you can go to my website, jasonwmoore.com.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you'd like to support us, you can go to our website, theAnalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and get onto our mailing list. See you next time.